Okay, I'm going to show you how to abuse some Ableton tools to make an effect similar to Disperser. All right, so Disperser is a really cool tool. It essentially does some kind of trickery with all-pass filters, and I definitely don't understand that technology entirely, but what an all-pass filter does is lets through the entire frequency spectrum, but it messes with the phase or the timing of different parts of that spectrum. So maybe we're going to let through all of the spectrum, but we're going to shift the phase of things around a particular center frequency. So as far as I understand it, that's how all-pass filters work. And Disperser is essentially a collection of all-pass filters that you can use to modify the phase of your signal. Let's have a look at that, and I'll show you how to make a similar thing out of Ableton stock plugins. Okay, so I've made a bass in Operator, and it's just a little sawtooth with a filter on it, low-pass filter, a little bit of envelope, and it sounds like this. Okay, and you can see I've got Disperser up on the screen. Let's turn it on and hear what it does to that. So you can hear and see that it's kind of smearing out the frequencies of the bass note. I'm going to hit it and then freeze the oscilloscope. So you can see that we get the high frequencies first, and then the bass tone is pushed out in time. So we hear the initial pluck of the bass really clearly because it happens before everything else, and then the lower parts of the signal come in. Disperser is doing that, and by modifying the frequency of the midpoint of the all-pass filters, we get different effects. So I'll unfreeze this and we'll check it out. So we get a whole bunch of different effects out of that. And it's a really common sound in psytrance and other kind of cleaner electronic styles because it's got such a characteristic wetness to the sound. So I've made a little effect rack here, which does a similar job. So you note we've turned off Disperser and we're just using this phase rotator rack. And we get really similar sounds out of it. So I've set a key map to the on-off of the phase rotator and Disperser, and here we can hear the difference of them with the same frequency set. So you can see they essentially do the exact same thing. All right, so let's get into this phase rotator. I actually got the idea for this phase rotator from a video that Chamberlain did for Gravitas Create, and I'll link it up in the corner. But essentially he uses the EQ3 to do this phase rotation trick. You can see that the frequency low here is mapped to this, the frequency high is mapped to this, and then this device on, it just turns on and off additional copies of that same rack. So we're going to build that from scratch now. But I thought that that was a really clever trick, turning this on to kind of control the amount. You can see that Disperser has this amount value, and that essentially is what this device on-off knob controls on this rack as well. So you can see that this rack is just, I think, 12 EQ3s all stacked up. And so if you just have one of them on, the effect is slightly less noticeable. And if you have two of them, more noticeable, 6, 9, 12-ish. So we'll rebuild this rack and I'll show you how to do it. Let's get rid of Disperser as well while we're at it. So this is the dry sawtooth pluck noise. And what we want is an EQ3. And we just want to put that in a group. We want to see the knobs, and we want to set frequency low to one of the knobs, probably macro 2, and the on-off to macro 1. That's all we actually really need to do. I'm going to set this frequency high all the way up because I just want it out of the way, up at 18 kilohertz. I don't really mind what it's doing. And so initially we just have... So you can hear it has a little bit of an effect down low, but not much. What we want to do is just duplicate this EQ3 a whole bunch. So I'm going to give it 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12. All right, that should be enough. Let's shrink them down. And at the moment, they're all on or they're all off. Here's what they do to the signal. So So they're doing what we want, but we want this device on knob to control the effect. We want to edit the mappings. Let's get rid of the scope. And you can see these device on values. Let's set the first one to 10, the second to 20, 30, and so on. All right, and then on these maximums, we're going to set them all to 0. All right, now I can turn off the mapping, and you can see that all of these turn on one at a time as we bring the knob all the way up. So now we can have the full effect, or none of it, or something in the middle. So we've essentially created something that sounds just like Disperser. It has a very similar effect on the sound. Let's pop open oscilloscope. You can see that we're delaying the lower parts of the signal longer than the upper parts of the signal. So we're getting that kind of phase distortion that has that characteristic sound. All right, so why does this work? Well, this essentially works because each of these EQ3s are introducing a little bit of phase distortion. So the way that the EQ3 works is essentially we've got a low pass filter and a high pass filter and then a big band pass in the middle. So that gain low is actually controlling the gain of a low passed copy of the signal, and the gain high is controlling the amplitude of a high pass copy of the signal, and the gain mid is controlling the volume of a band passed copy of the original signal. Now, in order to make the crossovers of the different filters as smooth as possible, they kind of cross over at various parts of the frequency spectrum, but not entirely perfectly. They introduce a little bit of phase distortion around that low pass filter and around that band pass filter and around that high pass filter. So by chaining up a whole bunch of these EQ3s and setting them all to the same frequencies, we introduce more phase distortion where those crossover frequencies are. That's why by adjusting the frequency of the low pass crossover, we're actually adjusting the frequency of the most of the phase distortion of our signal. So we've essentially created something that's pretty close to an all-pass filter, which is what Disperser uses to get its job done. We've just done it using multiple filters and kind of abusing the smooth crossovers that Ableton have put into the filter configurations in EQ3. You can also use the OTT crossovers to do something pretty similar, although I haven't gotten into the details on that. I'm not sure it sounds exactly the same as this. I really like this as a solution because EQ3 seems to be a much simpler device. It's kind of easier to think about. So this sounds great on all sorts of material, particularly on things with like a heavy bass component. As an example, here's a stock 909 kick, and here it is with the phase rotator. You hear it adds all sorts of extra stuff to it as it modifies the phase of the low end. Now, one of the cool things is that you can totally change the peak value of your signal without really influencing the sound of it. So here's the kick dry again, and you can see it goes over 0. If we turn on our phase rotator, that's at -6. It sounds basically the same. But we've gained 6 dB of headroom because that peak at the very start here has been radically reshaped. We've kind of smeared some of the frequency content out. So in this view, you can see that the original is really peaky, and in the final processed view, it's actually just kind of smeared out a little bit over time. It's got a much lower peak amplitude just because of the phase rotation. Okay, so that's this week's video. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope that saves you a few bucks trying to get something together that does weird phase rotation, and I hope you enjoyed chucking that on all sorts of different bass sounds because it sounds awesome. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.